In our world, it begins with the light of a screen. You scroll through your phone and watch a life unravel, a career destroyed by a single message dragged out from the past. We call it being exposed, being cancelled, a kind of social death. In Byzantium, they practiced the same art, but their tools were not keyboards and code. They used whispers in marble hallways, accusations of desire written on parchment, and a red-hot blade waiting in the shadows. They didn't delete a social media account. They deleted a future, permanently. This is the story of how a rumor in the bedroom could end an entire bloodline. The empire we speak of is Byzantium, the last descendant of Rome. Imagine it, a Roman empire draped in the cloak of Christian faith, with its capital, Constantinople, a city of golden domes, of silk and brocade, and of political intrigues, sharper than Damascus steel. An empire that lasted for over 1,000 years, seeing itself as the center of the civilized world, the final bastion of order and faith. And at the head of it all was the emperor. On one hand, he was the successor to Caesar, a demigod in flesh and blood, a man with absolute power on earth. The law was whatever he said it was. The lives of millions rested on the snap of his fingers. On the other hand, he had to be the 10th apostle, a living paragon of virtue for millions of believers. He was the defender of the faith, chosen by God. His every action was scrutinized through the lens of sanctity. So, how can one man be both a saint and a tyrant? How could he preach about humility while living in a palace of gold? The answer, through hypocrisy, and by ensuring that those moral laws were only applied to his enemies. And how do we know of these palace intrigues, these hidden histories? The answer lies in a book that no emperor wanted you to read, written in secret by a historian named Procopius, a man who by day wrote praises for the emperor, but by night recorded all of their raw, depraved, and brutal truths. That book is called The Secret History. Of course, Procopius had his own biases. His book is not gospel, it is a weapon of revenge, a work of propaganda, written by a man who felt betrayed by the very masters he once served. But that doesn't matter, because a lie that is believed is more dangerous than a truth that is ignored. And in Byzantium, these lies, these accusations, these half-truths became law. They became the foundation of a system of control built on the fear of what you did behind closed doors. The first weapon to be sharpened in this legal arsenal was the sin of the unnatural. Its architect was Justinian I, an emperor of extraordinary ambition. He ascended the throne in 527, at a time when the western part of the Roman Empire had long since fallen, ruled by Germanic kingdoms. Justinian did not accept that reality. He dreamed of re-establishing the glorious Roman Empire of old, a renovatio imperii, and his generals, Belisarius and Narses, nearly made that dream a reality, reconquering Italy in the bloody Gothic War, defeating the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, and retaking a portion of Spain. He was the man who commissioned the architectural masterpiece, the Hagia Sophia, a dome that seemed to hang suspended between heaven and earth, a monument so grand that upon its completion, Justinian was said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." And most importantly, he systemized 1,000 years of Roman law into a single code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation for much of Western law thereafter. He was a titan of history, a sleepless artisan who reshaped the world. But beneath the surface of these grand achievements was a brutal reality. Justinian's wars and building projects required a colossal amount of funding, and he was willing to do anything to get it. To understand the context of his moral laws, we must understand the Byzantine obsession with purity and heresy. For them, the empire was not just a political entity, but a reflection of God's order on earth. Any deviation in theology or morality was not just a personal sin, but a crack in the very foundation of the cosmos, an invitation for divine punishment in the form of plagues, earthquakes, or military defeats. Within this context, Justinian reinforced a series of particularly cruel provisions in his legal code. His law didn't describe the forbidden act in detail, it simply defined the punishment for anyone accused. And that punishment was not a fine or a few years in prison. It was fire, it was the sword, and sometimes it was a blade given to a surgeon. On paper, this was an effort to cleanse the empire of sin to please God. Justinian, in the preamble to one of his edicts, openly declared that such acts were the direct cause of famine, earthquakes, and pestilence. By punishing sinful individuals, he was protecting the entire empire from God's wrath. It was an irrefutable argument in a devoutly religious society. But did Justinian truly care for the souls of his subjects, or did he care more for their gold? Look at how this law was enforced. The accusation was easy to make, and nearly impossible to defend oneself against. Your enemy only needed to whisper to an official that you harbored forbidden desires. No witnesses were needed, no proof was required, only suspicion. A trial might be convened, but it was often a sham. Immediately, your property was confiscated, and you faced a choice between the pyre and the blade. This was not a wide-ranging moral crusade. There is no evidence of common farmers or artisans being hunted down en masse. Instead, the most prominent victims were all wealthy, influential men, senators, high-ranking officials. The historian John Malalas, for instance, records that many important figures were arrested, paraded through the streets, and brutally tortured based on these accusations. Their vast fortunes, of course, flowed directly into the imperial treasury, financing Justinian's wars and extravagant building projects. It was the perfect tool of political purge, disguised in the robes of piety. If men were controlled by their desires, then powerful women were controlled by their very bloodline. The hypocrisy here was barely concealed. The emperor could have dozens of mistresses, unofficial consorts, and fleeting affairs. It was a perquisite of power. Byzantine history is filled with emperors who elevated their lovers to positions of counsel, even granting them noble titles. But the empress, she needed only one misplaced glance, and the entire empire would tremble. Why? Because her fidelity was not a matter of personal morality. It was a matter of national security. An illegitimate child could contest the throne. A secret affair could create an opposition faction at court. The empress's chastity was the guarantee of the entire dynasty's stability. Any doubt about the heir's parentage could ignite a civil war. And Byzantine history is haunted by the women who challenged, or were accused of challenging, this rule. Look at Empress Theodora, Justinian's wife. She was one of the most formidable women in history. Her enemies, like Procopius, tell that she came from the stage, an actress and dancer, a profession considered no different from prostitution at the time. The secret history describes her performances with raw, vicious detail, for the sole purpose of destroying her reputation. That past should have been her fatal weakness, a permanent weapon in the hands of her enemies. But Theodora did not erase her past. She turned it into a shield and a warning. She co-ruled with Justinian as an equal, every bit as intelligent and ruthless as her husband. To understand Theodora's power, one must understand the society of Constantinople. The life of the city revolved around the hippodrome, not just a venue for chariot races, but a political stage. The populace was divided into factions, the most famous being the Blues and the Greens, who represented different social classes and political views. Justinian supported the Blues. Theodora, with her background, had ties to the Greens. This tension exploded during the terrifying Nika riots of 532. Sparked by the arrest of members from both factions, it quickly morphed into a full-blown rebellion against the regime. The people, united under the slogan Nika, conquer, burned the city and crowned a new emperor. While Justinian and his generals advised flight, Theodora gave a famous speech declaring that the imperial purple is a noble winding sheet. She would rather die an empress than live as an exile. Her words gave Justinian courage, and the revolt was crushed in a sea of blood, with some 30,000 people massacred in the hippodrome. After that, Theodora was not just a wife, she was a ruling partner. She had her own court, her own officials, and ran her own foreign policy. She influenced appointments, passed legislation, including laws protecting women from exploitation, banning forced prostitution, and granting women inheritance rights. She even founded a convent for former prostitutes, a refuge for women who shared her past. She showed everyone that power could cleanse any sin. But if Theodora was an example of a woman who rose despite her past, Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita was an extreme example of a woman born to power and wielding it wantonly. Zoe was one of the few empresses born in the purple, Porphyrogenita, meaning she was of the purest imperial blood. She came to the throne at an advanced age, after decades of living in suppression under her autocratic father, and when she gained her freedom, she used it to its fullest. Over a chaotic 2-decade period in the mid-11th century, Zoe married 3 times, elevated a lover to the throne, and co-ruled with her sister, also named Theodora. Her first husband, Romanos III, was allegedly poisoned by her in his bath. Immediately, she married her young lover, Michael IV. When he died, she adopted his nephew and made him emperor, Michael V. When he conspired against her by forcing her into a convent, Zoe led a popular uprising, had him overthrown and blinded. Finally, she married her third husband, Constantine IX. Zoe behaved with a freedom that only a male emperor would have dared to dream of. She changed husbands and lovers like clothing, all to protect her own position. The court's reaction revealed the problem. They weren't horrified because she was immoral. They were horrified because a woman had dared to use power and sexuality like a man. She was an anomaly, a chaotic force in the patriarchal order of the empire, and female ambition did not stop there. Consider the case of Irina Saranta-Pechina, or Irene of Athens, in the late 8th century. She became regent for her young son, Constantine VI, when her husband died. Irene was a fervent supporter of the veneration of icons, a practice that had been banned by previous emperors. She convened the Second Council of Nicaea to officially restore icon veneration, a bold political move. But when her son came of age and wanted to rule in his own right, Irene did not relinquish power. The confrontation between mother and son lasted for years, filled with plots and betrayals. Finally, in 797, Irene made her move. She had her own son arrested and ordered him to be blinded. The wounds were so severe that he died shortly after. For the first time in history, a woman ruled the Byzantine Empire not as a regent, but as a basileus, an emperor in her own right. Her ruthless act of murdering her own son for the throne shocked the entire Christian world, but it also showed that in the Byzantine power game, there were no limits, not even maternal love. By now you might think that all of this was about enforcing a strict Christian morality, about an empire trying to cleanse the souls of its people. But the truth is, it wasn't. These laws were rarely, if ever, applied to a blacksmith or a farmer. They were forged for a single purpose: to be used by the elite against the elite. In the corridors of power in Constantinople, the real sin wasn't lust. The real sin was weakness. And now we will look at the final punishment for the weak, a punishment designed not to take your life, but to take everything that made you who you were. And so we come to the final weapon, the most characteristic and also the most brutal punishment of Byzantium, a single word: castration. Why such a barbaric punishment? Because it solved a problem that execution could not. It eliminated a rival without creating a martyr. It ended a bloodline without spilling royal blood. It was a political and biological erasure, a living death. This punishment was not a Byzantine invention. It had long existed in Eastern empires, but the Byzantines perfected it, turning it from a simple act of brutality into a sophisticated tool of statecraft. It was applied systematically to deposed emperors, to defeated rebels, and to political rivals whom the emperor wished to remove humanely. Humane here meant not killing them, but taking away everything that made them a threat. Put yourself in the victim's position, a defeated general, a fallen politician. You are not beheaded. You are simply changed. You are still alive. You still breathe, eat, and walk through the palace, but you have become a shadow. Your voice grows higher. Your beard stops growing. You cannot have children. Your bloodline ends here. Your legacy is erased. You are a dead end of history. You are permanently removed from the game of power, turned into a harmless creature, a living ornament at court. And this is where the story becomes truly strange, because in that cruelty, the Byzantines created a paradox of power. Byzantium took away a man's masculinity, and then gave him the power of an empire. The castrated, the eunuchs, became a force within the court. They were considered safe because they could not found their own dynasty. They had no children to pass power to. Their only loyalty was to the throne, undistracted by familial ambition. They formed a third gender in Byzantine society. not quite men, not quite women. They could move freely in the women's quarters, the gymnasium, where other men were forbidden. This unique position allowed them to become the listeners, the messengers, and the confidants of both the emperor and the empress. Where did they come from? Some were foreign princes, sent as hostages and castrated to ensure loyalty. Some were poor boys sold by their own parents, hoping their son would find a future in the palace. Others were prisoners of war, and some, of course, were punished political rivals. Their path was not easy. They underwent a rigorous education, studying literature, theology, and the art of administration. However, despite their power, they also faced deep-seated prejudice. Writers and theologians often depicted them as sly, weak, and untrustworthy. They were both respected for their power and reviled for their physical state. They were outsiders at the very center of power, a living contradiction. But it was this marginal status that gave them a unique perspective. Unbound by the ties of family and clan, they could often act as objective technocrats. Many eunuchs became great patrons of the arts, literature, and monasticism. They built churches, sponsored writers, and collected ancient manuscripts. In many ways, they were the custodians of the empire's intellect, managing not only the treasury, but its cultural heritage as well. They became the closest advisors, generals, and financial administrators. They were the bureaucracy that ran the empire. Highly educated eunuchs often managed the complex government departments, administered tax collection, and oversaw public works. They were trusted because their advancement depended entirely on imperial favor, not on a family name, and sometimes they became the most powerful men in the world. The case of Basil Lycapenos is a classic example. An illegitimate son of an emperor, Basil was castrated as a youth to remove him from the line of succession, but that did not stop him. Through his intelligence and ruthlessness, he rose to become the chief minister, the Parakoimomenos, and in effect ruled the empire from behind the curtain for nearly 45 years. He appointed and deposed emperors. He commanded armies, he controlled the treasury, he amassed an enormous personal fortune. He could not have children, but he was the father of the empire. A man whose future was taken from him became the one who decided the future of millions. Or consider the case of Narses, one of Justinian's greatest generals. A eunuch, he did not have the physique of a warrior, but he possessed a brilliant strategic mind. It was Narses who completed the reconquest of Italy, a feat at which other normal generals had failed. He demonstrated that in the Byzantine world, power came not from physical prowess, but from intellect and unwavering loyalty to the throne. That was the logic of Byzantium, a system that created the perfect instruments of power by destroying the human body. So, we return to the initial question, why could a rumor in the bedroom end an entire bloodline? Because in Byzantium, the bedroom was never a private place, it was a battlefield. And to understand that battlefield, you must understand its geography. The great palace of Constantinople was not a single building, but a sprawling complex of halls, churches, gardens, and hundreds of rooms, connected by long corridors and, sometimes, secret passages. It was a self-contained world where every wall had ears. Plots were not hatched in boardrooms, but in whispered conversations during a walk in the garden, and notes passed by a trusted servant. Information was the most precious currency, and the eunuchs, with their freedom of movement, were often its most powerful brokers. We have seen the fate of the senators purged by Justinian's moral laws, the boundless ambition of Empress Zoe, the ruthlessness of Irene, the terrible punishment awaiting a defeated rebel, and the strange path to power of a eunuch like Basil Lycapenos. All of them, whether hunter or prey, were players in the same ruthless game, a game where the public laws were merely a cover for the unspoken rules. The emperors were not truly trying to enforce morality, they were enforcing power, and sex, with all its desire, jealousy, and secrecy, was the most perfect tool. It is an inherent human weakness, and anything that is a weakness can be exploited. This system, based on surveillance and accusation, created a constant atmosphere of paranoia and fear among the elite. It prevented strong opposition factions from forming, because anyone could be brought down by an unprovocable charge. But what was the price? An empire that constantly devoured itself. The most talented minds, the best generals, could be eliminated because of a political plot. The energy of the ruling class was spent on internal struggles instead of dealing with external threats, like the Sasanian Persian Empire to the east, or the rise of Slavic kingdoms in the Balkans. This paranoia might help an emperor keep his throne, but it slowly eroded the strength of the very empire he ruled. Ultimately, this story reveals a deeper truth about the nature of absolute power. When a state seeks to control everything, it does not stop at borders, armies, or treasuries. It will seek to enter the most private of spaces, your thoughts, your faith, and finally, your very body. In Byzantium, your body did not belong to you, it belonged to the state, and the state had the right to reshape it, to cut it, to neutralize it. All for one thing, the stability of the throne. They used the sins of the flesh to control the powerful, an effective method but a risky one. Because when you teach others how to weaponize faith and morality, one day, that weapon will be turned against you. But what happens when the powerful use the image of God himself to overthrow one another? What happens when the war is no longer about what occurs in the bedroom, but what hangs on the walls of a church? So the Byzantine emperors ruled through a fear of sin. A single illicit desire, a single crack in the armor of piety, could bring down a dynasty. But what if we journeyed to an empire where the rules were inverted, where the greatest taboos were sacred duties? An empire where the line between God and king, brother and sister, mortal and divine, was deliberately erased in the royal bedroom. Next time, we leave the cold stone of Constantinople for the hot sands of the Nile. We will explore the sacred incest and divine desires of Egypt's pharaohs, where the most horrific practices were considered an act of creation.